I'm a Tahltan First Nation member. Our nation is up in Northwest British Columbia, and we're miners. Like, mining's big up there. We have 70% of the Golden Triangle. Red Chris operates up there. Bruce Jack. We have KSM, SK Creek galore. So it's very the mineral endowment's fantastic. But I was on the board of the Tahltan Nation Development Corporation for 3.5 years as vice chair, and a big part of our strategy was diversifying out of mining because we're so reliant on it. Right? It's red, like a huge chunk of our revenue. The majority of it comes from the Red Chris mine as an economic development company. If that mine were to shut its doors for any many reasons, this could happen. Like, let's say the commodity price drop, anything, we would take a significant hit to both our business and our nation. Right? So diversification is one of our main strategies as a group to get out of that mining. And I see Nations Royalty as a financial tool for people to instantly diversify outside of whatever commodity or asset that they're in.
Welcome, everybody. Ken Coates from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm bringing you one of our regular podcasts on Indigenous economic development. Delighted to be with you today with Kody Penner, Vice President of Corporate Development for Nations Royalty. As you might know, if you follow Macdonald-Laurier Institute, we're really interested in the innovative things that Indigenous communities and businesses and economic development corporations are doing to sort of find a niche in the Canadian economy and to produce prosperity for their communities. Came across the work of Nations Royalty a little while ago and got really excited about it. It's an organization doing some interesting things to transform the financial basis of Indigenous involvement in the natural resource sector. And we've seen that change in a whole bunch of ways in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, when an Aboriginal person got a job as a foreman on the shop floor, we were kind of excited about that. That doesn't work anymore. We've got Indigenous communities that want to own mines. They want to be part owners of mines. They want to be shareholders in mines. They want to be involved in the whole enterprise. Kody, you're doing some great work. So welcome. Delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So Kody, we're just going to have a conversation for half an hour or so. And I'm just so excited about this. And we were talking before the fact that we'd like to sort of bring you back again in a month or two and bring in a couple of your partners and then sort of talk about how it's working for them and why they got involved with this. But let's explain the concept. The idea of Nations Royalty is a different approach to sort of royalty and impacted benefit agreements and how Indigenous people actually engage with the financial aspects of mining. So why don't you give us a bit of a history lesson on Nations Royalty?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me here. And it's a really innovative model, but it's also an old model, is what we like to tell people, right? So we work in the mining royalty space, primarily mining. We do look at base metals and energy and precious metals. And mining royalty companies have been around for decades, right? They've been around for 30 plus years. Wheaton Precious Metal is the largest mining royalty company on the market. It's about a $40 billion market cap Canadian, and Franco-Nevada and Royal Gold and so on. We're using that exact same business model, but in the Indigenous space. When you look at the landscape in the Indigenous Canadian landscape, there's over $350 million that were paid out in cash payments just in the metals and mining space in Canada to Indigenous groups just in 2023. When you include oil and gas on top of that, it's actually over $700 million paid out in 1 year in cash to different Indigenous groups. But all of those payments live in isolation. They go directly to the Indigenous group. They're not shared amongst each other. And when you bring these royalties together into a single vehicle, Nations Royalty or any other royalty company, the valuation relative to the assets that you own actually rises, right? So that's how royalty companies make money. They basically create a portfolio of many royalties, which essentially lowers the risk for any single royalty because now you become a small owner in many, and you've diversified that risk amongst many different assets. And that's the premise of our business. It's the same business model as those other ones, but in the Indigenous space. And we're first movers in the space. No one has ever done this before in the Indigenous space. And going to that $700 million kind of market for it. It's a tremendous opportunity set that if we're able to consolidate, we can first lower risk for Indigenous groups. We know mining is inherently risky, right? We saw one up the Eagle Mine up in the Yukon is a recent example. And there's many others. If you are able to diversify that risk away, you're essentially diversifying the nation's financial risk as a whole, right? And as you bring these payments together, once again, the valuation rises relative to what the asset's worth. Not to go too down.
Help me understand this. I love the idea, because it seems to me that what you've got is a situation where somebody signs an impact and benefit agreement, and you see these things happen all the time, and they'll say, oh, they're getting royalties, and they're going to get $10 million over the 20-year lifespan of the mine. And the reality is maybe they'll get $20 million. It all depends on whether the mine has a glitch in the mining activity itself, whether the markets hold strong or whatever else. So what you're saying is that by actually joining as a group and doing this to a nation's royalty or another royalty company, you're basically sharing that risk across a whole bunch of different things. So the risk, instead of it being a 20% chance of it declining, it's actually a 5% chance of it declining. So you can actually get more cash out on a regular basis.
Exactly. Right. So that's exactly what we're doing. And when you allow outside investors to invest into that portfolio, once again, to the example that you just gave, if you have the same return, but you've lowered the risk, then your relative valuation is going to be higher. Right. So that's how our model works. If we're able to, once again, diversify amongst many different Indigenous owned benefit agreement payments, royalties, then our relative valuation or what the assets are actually worth should rise. And the largest mining royalty companies like Wheaton Precious Metals, it trades at 2 times the price over the net asset value, which essentially means, $10 million in a company that's worth 1 times price over net asset value is worth $10 million. The $10 million cash over $10 million. If that exact same $10 million was in Wheaton Precious Metals, who trade at 2 times price over net asset value, that $10 million is actually worth $20 million to the market. That's the value creation that we're looking to accomplish by pooling these Indigenous payments together. You can create value above and beyond what they're worth by themselves. And it almost seems like magic, but it's a proven model. People have been doing it for 30 years. It's the crown jewel in the mining space, right? People love royalty companies. The issue is it's hard to grow, and we think we have a strategy for rapid growth in the Indigenous space.
Well, you got a great strategy, obviously, for 2 reasons. Number one, there's a lot of First Nations involved, and Métis and Inuit groups are involved in mining. Some of them for the very first time. And I think it seems to me that one of the big problems with Indigenous involvement in mining is they're tying their entire future to a single property. And you're just saying, we've got a gold mine here, and it's got a 7-year lifespan, and we're going to make $3 million, a year for 7 years, $21 million or whatever else. And then the mine has a problem, and the money disappears after year 2, doesn't come back until year 7. That seems to be the standard sort of problem. And what you're basically doing is saying we can capitalize the value of that partnership you have with the mining community and give it back to you as a net asset.
100%, right? And once again, as we diversify that portfolio, it diversifies the nation's net worth. When you think of the net worth, let's just make an example. An Indigenous group has a single asset, one mine, and that's going to pay out 1% of all the revenue for the life of the mine. Let's just, for example's sake, it's 10 years at $10 million. Today, all of their 100% of their net worth is in a single asset, right? If they were to hypothetically partner with us today, they would have diversified all of their future cash flows by being partnered with us because we already own royalties on different assets. So it's kind of future-proofing those payments as well. To your example, let's say that they operated for 4 years and then something happened. And then you would lose 6 years of those payments in that example. But if you front-end loaded that work with Nations Royalty or other royalty companies, you essentially diversify all that risk away in those future payments.
Okay.
Right? It's a really interesting tool. And so I'm a Tahltan First Nation member. Our nation is up in Northwest British Columbia, and we're miners. Like, mining's big up there. We have 70% of the Golden Triangle. Red Chris operates up there, Bruce Jack. We have KSM, SK Creek galore. So it's it's very the mineral endowment's fantastic, but I was on the board of the Tahltan Nation Development Corporation for 3.5 years as vice chair. And a big part of our strategy was diversifying out of mining because we're so reliant on it, right? It's red, like a huge chunk of our revenue, the majority of it comes from the Red Chris mine as an economic development company. If that mine were to shut its doors for any many reasons, this could happen. Like, let's say the commodity price drop, anything, we would take a significant hit to both our business and our nation, right? So diversification is one of our main strategies as a group to get out of that mining. And I see Nations Royalty as a financial tool for people to instantly diversify outside of whatever commodity or asset that they're in.
So explain to me how this works on a very practical level. And I want to come back and talk about the Tahltan in a little while, because I'm not sure that people across the country will know what a sort of an interesting and remarkable place that is in terms of its involvement in the mining sector. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you got to agree with a mining company, you're getting a 1% royalty on whatever return is coming in. Usually at the end of the year, somebody does an evaluation, they look at the returns from the mine, they send you a check for 1%. Under this model, do you still get an annual check? And is it for more money than you would get? That's the model, right? So you get more money, but on an annual basis, or is it more just that your total asset is worth more and you can basically borrow against it or use it in other formats?
Yeah, definitely. So how it works with the Nishka, who are our founding partner. So Northwest BC, once again, Tahltan is in the northwest corner, like the northwest tip of BC. Just south is the Nishka Nation. They're actually our founding partners. So they have 5 different royalty streams coming from our benefit agreement payments, coming from 5 different mining assets. And essentially what they did is they vended those in for equity in Nations Royalty. So they actually own 77% of our company. We're publicly traded, so we trade on the TSXV and in the States and in Germany. And they went from receiving, $1 million of somewhere around there on their Brucejack asset to owning 77% of our company. When we went public at 130 million. We've come down a little bit from that, but on any given day, they own 70 to 80 million dollars in our company, right? And that's on their balance sheet. They have that now. So when you compare that to, receiving $1 million checks every year to having 70, 80 million on the balance sheet, and as we grow, we look to multiply that. Obviously, our number one kind of strategy or our number one goal is shareholder return. Nishka could be in a position in 4 or 5 years from now where they're sitting on a few $100 million worth of Nations Royalty equity, right? And to your point, they can go borrow on that. They can start to liquidate some if they want to go do a project that could have a nice return. We do look to be dividend producing in the next few years, but we do need some more cash flowing royalties. We want to be fiscally responsible. But ideally, in the next few years, we're paying dividends as well. So an Indigenous group could have went from having, let's say it's a project that's 5 years out. It's a really big project, but it's not actually going to produce cash flow for 5 years. They could bring that value forward, bolster their balance sheet, potentially get dividends in the next few years, and then hopefully that balance sheet will multiply as we grow, and they could be in a much, much stronger financial position than if they just had waited for annual payments.
I really like the idea of bringing that value forward. It's interesting, when folks who aren't familiar with Indigenous mining and resource development involvement, it's very frustrating when you've got a situation where the community votes to have a mine and they put the support behind the mine, and then you've got a 5 or 6 or sometimes 10-year ramp up where you're getting all of the disruptions of mining. They're building a new road. The moose are on the wrong side of the mountain now for a while. A lot of dust all over the place. You got trailers coming into your town and setting up for the mine workers to live and that sort of thing. And that you haven't got any money yet. And you're still waiting for the mine to start operating. But this model here brings that forward in time, right, doesn't it? So you can actually start getting the return fairly quickly.
So 100%. And Ken, when you think on a big scale, when I think of this model and I think of Indigenous wealth and Canadian kind of economic reconciliation, I'm going back to that kind of market value. So $700 million was paid out in cash payments just in 2023 to Indigenous people. Think of all of the future payments, to your point, that are 5-10 years out, and agreements have only gotten better as far as the structure is concerned in the past probably 5 to 10 years. So from 2017 to 2023, we saw 129% increase in those cash payments, right? So picture how much larger they'll be in 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And now picture the present value of all of those future payments. It's in the billions and billions and billions. And if you put it into a model like ours, and if we traded what those high valuations, such as like a 1.5 to a 2 times price over net asset value, we could actually multiply those billions. And that's the type of visioning that I like to see in the company, and what could actually change the financial landscape for Indigenous people across Canada and internationally. Like, picture monetizing all of those future payments to today. And then when we talk about Indigenous inclusion in projects, whether it's equity or infrastructure or what have you, they have billions of dollars of capital to go do that. And they can do it before the projects start, so they don't have to wait until production, where they're already 5 years behind on the planning, right? That's one thing that I really saw on the Indigenous economic side and development side is where sometimes Indigenous groups are ready because they don't have the capital or the capacity until the mine's operating. Then you have a big, $50 million bid or tender on your plate, and you're like, oh my God, I'm not prepared for this. What if you could have that capital up front, prepared now, and then really be involved from the get-go? That's the power.
There's so many things I really like about this. And one of the things that really stands out is that the whole purpose of for Indigenous folks getting involved in resource development is the idea of own source revenues.
Yep.
My view, now, Kody, you don't necessarily agree with me, but my view is that Indigenous communities are sick and tired of being dependent on the government of Canada. And they don't like having to apply for government grants and report on government grants, et cetera, et cetera.
So, Ken, the Secretary Treasurer of Nisga'a, Charles Morvan, says they need $8 billion under management to be completely self-sufficient from government payments. Nation's royalty is a cornerstone investment for them to get there. It completely, with what you just said, completely aligns with Nisga'a's vision and why this company was created. And we see this as, I like to say, true Indigenous economic wealth generator.
I'm sorry.
I see this as a wealth generator, right?
I just love that part of it. But the interesting piece that comes in there as well is that, the other big issue is that right now, the federal government has finally come up with a new federal First Nations and First Peoples sort of investment corporation. You're going to be able to get some money from the federal government. Well, you know how the federal government works. You got a great idea. Well, 5 years from now, you might actually get a final answer, right? It takes a long time, even if it's arm's length, and the new organization will have more flexibility and all that kind of stuff. But you still have to go to Ottawa. You still have to make your presentations in Ottawa. What you're talking about here is a situation where the Nisga'a not only will have that asset that's generating revenue for them, but they now have access to capital. They can capitalize that asset. And what I find very interesting is that for groups like Nisga'a and the Tahltan, you have a situation where your communities are in the very remote regions in northwestern British Columbia, most beautiful places on the planet. Yeah. I was raised in the Yukon, Kody, so we used to come south to visit you, right? And I used to go fishing around these lakes, so I know the area reasonably well. And but of course, a lot of your people actually don't live in Tahltan territory anymore. They live down south. They're living in Vancouver, living in Victoria, and places like that. And a lot of the remote communities are looking for places to get enough capital to build a residential complex, to build an apartment building, to build a retail operation in Vancouver or in North Vancouver or in Surrey or someplace like that, Toronto, so they can generate wealth and opportunity for their people wherever they happen to be. And this model seems to liberate you on both sides. It gets more of a direct income flow, more controllable flow, but also has that asset base built up, so that if you look at this in a positive way, and then you're always very careful about saying there's other royalty companies out there, so if other people do the same thing with other groups, they're going to get the same kind of return, is that First Nations are going to become a formidable force in the Canadian economy overall.
Look, I think this company could be a multi-billion-dollar royalty company that can compete with largest royalty companies. What other group has access to land-based and assets like the Indigenous people of Canada? And it's starting to go more internationally as well. Australia has some royalties. They're not quite as developed as Canada, and same with the States. But I can see this being a major player in the mining financial space. And this is just the first. So we're the first and largest majority Indigenous owned company. We're hoping to build capacity with Indigenous people both on the board of directors and our management team, using Indigenous businesses to help them start to access the public markets as well. Because something nice about the public markets is you have access to risk capital.
Right.
You have access to risk capital that can build projects from the ground up. Look at the junior mining space, look at the mining development space, right? You need that risk capital for the inception of these projects. And like I said, we're the first majority Indigenous owned public company. We certainly hope we're not the last. The Selkirk First Nation actually bought the Minto mine, which I'm sure you're aware of, right? From the Yukon, out of receivership, right? And they actually own that mining asset. It's a brownfield restart. And out of our group, we're actually helping develop it. So we're helping build capacity in the public markets. And to your point, let's look 5-10 years down the road. People see this example, they see how it's done. We're helping others learn about the markets, bringing capital into these projects. And I think Indigenous folks are going to be a serious player in the public markets and have some large businesses that will inspire the rest of the world as well.
Well, let's go back a little bit and go back to the tall tent thing, because I think your idea about sort of this is going to inspire First Nations. There's some transformative elements to this. But the tall tent area is spectacular. It's in the middle of the mountains, beautiful. The Skeena River goes through there. Dease Lake is up there. It's tough territory. I'm glad they got some roads, because I wouldn't want to have to walk through some of those hills and mountains there. It's quite something. But the tall tent, 30 years ago, there's almost nothing much going on in the area. There's some forestry, a little bit of forestry, some mining exploration going on. And the tall tent basically made a decision, a very hard decision. Your community had a lot of debates about this. First Nation had debates about this. Before you said, we're going to get involved in mining only if it benefits us. And if the mine is a bad mine, we're going to say, no, you can't build it in this area. And you have said no to some properties. If it's a good mine and you got good returns coming to the community, you can actually get real returns. And I don't think most people in Canada have a clue what's going on in tall tent territory. If they did, they'd be excited about it, because it essentially is Indigenous controlled resource development with really good corporate partners. You know, you're not at odds with the mining industry. You're actually collaborating with them. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you look at some of our partnerships, so my job prior to this was at Tech Resources. So I worked in the copper growth team. It's a kind of business planning strategy type role. But the reason I bring that up is Tech Resources and the Galore Creek project have history going back to the early 2000s. And I have family members and people that I know where it's like they're so connected with the project and like with the people, it's almost like family.
Yeah.
Right. But it's because they've been good operators since they were there in the past, and all through the years until 2025, they've been consistent and open and trusting and things like that. And I can say the same for Skeena Resources, Newmont, Seabridge, all these great companies, right? They've done their part, but Teltan has taken it upon themselves to create agreements and structures that hold companies accountable, right? And you actually saw the first Section 7 consent-based permit with SK Creek, and you're going to see the next one with the Red Chris block cave expansion. Sorry. Yep. So just seeing those and the IPAs and the co-management agreements, all these things that Teltan and past leaders, shout out to them, have built up over the past 30 years. TNEC has really brought us to a place where, to your point, like mining and Teltan are very intertwined. If you're a responsible, sustainable operator, we can work together. If you're not, it might not go as well. But kind of created our own framework that seems to be working for us.
Well, it is, and it's one of the interesting things. People still have. I describe it sort of as a poverty mentality around Indigenous economic development. There's still this idea that Southern Canadians, non-Aboriginal Canadians, have to help Aboriginal people as acts of generosity and kindness. And I've sort of been thinking for a long time, though, that's just not the wrong way to go. Aboriginal folks are smart and bright and talented, hardworking as you could possibly imagine. Right? Great. You get out of the way and give them the resources. And you're talking about a new resource that's coming here. And I think on a global scale, the major impetus, I've been lots of conversations over the years with sort of mining companies and government officials from Japan all the way to Scandinavia and Germany and places like that. And very often the first part of the conversation is, we'd be interested in coming to Canada, but the First Nations oppose everything. And I say, well, hold on a second. And I use the tall tent, I use the Nisga'a as examples. I'm talking to situation. Minto Mine was one I used before. Cameco in northern Saskatchewan. Some of the developments in Arctic Quebec. A Valley Mine up in Labrador. These are really good collaborative sort of projects. And you can see them going, well, That's not what we're hearing in the media. We're hearing about Aboriginal people opposing mining. I said, well, actually, these other First Nations people, I'm not a First Nations person,
Yeah.
the First Nations people are too busy working. They're not protesting. They've made a decision. They're monitoring the development. They're making sure that the environmental and social impacts are mediated and moderated, right? They're just getting on with business. This is actually globally going to be one of the most important elements. And it seems to me that when First Nations have the capital to lead the process, as opposed to waiting for the process to come to them, that seems to me where you want to go.
I would completely agree. It's funny you say that. I was just in Japan actually on a trip with this called the Kekihashi Project with the Asia Pacific Foundation, and I was chatting with some mining investors, and this topic was actually brought up, and I was laughing. Like, I work at Nations Royalty, first majority Indigenous owned public company, very involved in the space, and I was teaching them about it, and they were like instantly like, "That's to your point. That's not what I really read or what I hear. This and that." I'm like, it's a great place to invest, right? Safe jurisdiction. We've come through a bit of a process where there are better frameworks for consultation and whatnot in recent years, I would say. And I was also in London and Zurich, kind of giving that same messaging. So it's just about getting the message across. But as mentioned, past leaders have done tremendous work on the Indigenous side and the government side in industry, right, to get us to a place where I think we're a good jurisdiction to invest in, both in mining and other natural resources. And I can't kind of wait to see the future too.
So Cody, interesting your reaction to this. People sort of ask me, I'd worked in Indigenous issues for a long time, and they sort of say, well, what can we expect in the future? What are the one or two or three things you really worry about? And I said, well, not worry is the wrong word, but there's two things. Number one is we absolutely have to deal with the social and cultural crises at the community level. When you have issues with opioids and when you have issues with drug and alcohol abuse and extreme poverty and poor housing, it's unconscionable for a country as rich as Canada to have those problems, right? We have to deal with that. But I said the flip side is the other thing that Canadians are really going to have to work on. It's going to take a long time to get used to this. To get used to the idea of Indigenous people being wealthy, because you've got 200 years of a poverty mentality around Indigenous folks, and the idea that you've got a prominent Tahltan person sitting in a big tower in downtown Vancouver, looking out over Stanley Park, and running a multi-million-dollar corporation that is going to hopefully build into $1 billion asset base over the years, right?
Yep. It's
just not the mindset that people have, because we sort of have put them in that cubbyhole that says you're poor and suffering. I look at that and say, absolutely, you got to deal with those issues. The best way you deal with the issues is to empower First Nations people to take control of the future.
I think you're bang on with that. I'll give you a funny example. I wasn't actually here for, but when we were doing our initial public offering, the financing, so we did a $10 million raise in May, going around to all these different investor bases throughout the States and Canada, there was a huge discriminatory kind of view on it. Can First Nations do that? Are they willing to take the risk to go into the public markets? Like, are you sure? Like, you know what I mean? It's not like an empowering, like, oh, that's fantastic. This is a cool idea, this and that. We had to kind of overcome that. It really exists in the financial space and in others.
Yes.
And exactly to your point, that's kind of the view on it. So now it's like, okay, we're on any given day, like an $80-90 million market cap royalty company, which is, on the smaller side for them, but we look to be a large one. And other Indigenous groups are going to start accessing the public markets, just like Minto most likely will. Moving into the future, and it's kind of overcoming that viewpoint and supporting it, and as an investor, being part of it. I tell our investor base, and a lot are excited. I'm like, look, this is the only company where you invest alongside an Indigenous group. If you put, we have a pretty small public float right now. If you put $1 million into our stock, it might go up 10-15%. Nishka's net worth on this equity just went up 10-15% with you. Like, it's a pretty cool thing to me that you're investing alongside an Indigenous group like this directly. And it's something that people got to get used to. We're out there messaging it all the time, this podcast, many others, and getting people used to the fact that, yes, Indigenous people are strong. We have a tremendous amount of value in our royalties and in other assets, and we're going to start utilizing them as we move forward.
Well, listen, Cody, this is going to be the first of many conversations. I want to sort of put it to you that we'd love to have you come back with one of your partners, maybe Initiative for an hour, or Tahltan or somebody like that, to sort of talk through sort of where you're going in a month or two. But the whole purpose of Macdonald-Laurier getting involved in the Indigenous involvement in the natural resource economy was to, quite frankly, to get to this point. Our project started about 13 years ago, and we remember having our first. We had a press conference in Ottawa, and the conference we wrote. Our first paper was actually on the Indigenous people and natural resource economy.
Cool.
And my argument back then, probably just growing up in the North, was that Indigenous people are far more involved in the resource economy than you know. 13 years ago, they were involved. The tall time were heavily involved, right? The country didn't know this. And so a bunch of the journalists who were there said, well, this is all well and good, but it's not going to happen. This is just, Indigenous people aren't going to get involved, and Indigenous people just oppose mining. And I said, no, Indigenous people oppose bad mining. And
100%.
they oppose mining that does not produce decent returns for their community. Why put up with disruptions if there's nothing in it for them on their territories, right? And so it's taken 13 years, but 13 years ago, if you said, down the road, you're going to be talking to a really bright young tall 10 fellow who's up there in the middle of setting up an equity company that's going to be sharing royalties with Indigenous groups around the world, people would have thought I was crazy. But I was optimistic. Didn't know this particular idea was going to come forward, but it's a neat project, Kody. I wish you all the best with it. And please keep us informed how it goes so we can sort of keep following up and letting our audience know what's actually going on. So, Kody Penner, thank you very much on behalf of Nations Royalty. It's wonderful to have you with us and wonderful to hear your story. You're going to make a real impact on the Canadian Indigenous economic development space. Thank you very much.
I appreciate all those kind words, Ken. Thank you.